Hi, everyone. Mike Vinoy, Vice President of Marketing with Asure Software. Got an interesting topic today. So during the pandemic, so many employers had to send their workforce home, right? And clearly there's been a continuum to work from home, flex work that's been going on for a couple decades, right? But the pandemic, not only did it just simply accelerate a trend, it was an overnight shift where, okay, we legally had to work from home in many cases. What's happened since, however, that is catching some employers a little flat-footed is not realizing the compliance impacts of those employees working from home. So if I, in my hometown of St. Louis, if there's an employer downtown, I got people coming from the Missouri side. I've got workers coming across the river from the Illinois side, but the work is being performed in an office downtown. No big deal, right? But when those people go home, what are the differences in what are the legal requirements for, say, overtime? What are the legal requirements for taxation if employees are actually performing the work in Illinois on my behalf instead of performing the work in my office in Missouri? So there's all kinds of compliance and tax impacts of employees working remotely. And I think there's a lot of employers just haven't really thought about this before because they didn't have to, right? Maybe the majority of their workforce worked from one location, and the pandemic changed that. Maybe it's just the tight labor market that I'm open now to hiring employees who work flexibly. Maybe I have an employee who says, "Hey, I'm going to spend the summer in my RV. I promise I'm going to have good Wi-Fi. Is that okay, boss?" And we think, "Huh, what the heck? As long as they do the work." But where they perform work actually matters in the eyes of the law. So we're not giving guidance to say no to those things, but we are saying eyes wide open. Some of these decisions have probably some unforeseen, unintended consequences. So to help me unpack this really complex topic, Brian Shenker from Jackson Lewis. Brian is a regular guest on the show. He practices law for Jackson Lewis. He's got extensive experience defending class action and collective action lawsuits under federal and state wage and hour laws. He's successfully defended wage and hour audits conducted by the U.S. and New York State Departments of Labor, and he regularly handles cases before courts and administrative agencies involving claims of discrimination, sexual harassment, and retaliation. So very well qualified. Always enjoy talking to you, Brian. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. And wage and hour compliance is really an area employers can't avoid and should really be proactive. And so I think a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today, maybe things that have been overlooked, but certainly if they have, time to take a look at these things.
Yeah, very good. All right, so normally when you and I are kind of unpacking a complex topic, we'll talk about the legalities of it all. We kind of then end with maybe the sticks and, hey, this is why you need to pay attention. We're kind of reversing the order today. The stick is really important here because the potential consequences of doing it wrong, even if by accident, are pretty stiff. Can you speak into that, please?
Yeah, exactly. So, employers that, don't set and enforce policies, including, where and when non-exempt employees might work, may be able to work, this can lead to, substantial exposure, even, class action exposure. So, this is one area, the wage and hour context, that, substantial compliance is not a defense. Small or technical violations in this area can lead to massive exposures. So something that, again, companies need to be aware of these issues. And look, when we're talking about minimum wage, under the FLSA, right now minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. As we'll get to, many states are above that. But failure to pay minimum wage, that's going to be, for instance, the difference between the rate that was paid and the full minimum wage, and that'll add up, especially if there are multiple employees subject to those violations. Same thing with overtime. The general rule is that all employees are entitled to time and a half for hours worked over 40, and failure to pay that rate or maybe not to pay for all hours that worked, such as issues with off the clock work, will result in substantial overtime monies being owed. So in these types of cases, right, they can recover their unpaid wages. That's the simple part, right? That and again, we'll talk about there might be even higher burdens under state law that could increase damages. But one of the things here is that I often see in litigation is a dispute over hours. And so, one of the things we talk about for damages is that if an employer doesn't have records, an employee can come in and say, they worked 70, 80 hours a week. It might not be reasonable. It might be far from reality. But without contemporaneous time records, the DOL, the courts will likely accept what the employee is saying unless there's specific evidence to the contrary. So, in combating these, potential penalties and wages owed, time records are key. And that brings you to liquidated damages. This is one of the things that really, I guess you could say, hits employers over the head, right? In addition to unpaid wages, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, employees will recover 100% of those unpaid wages as liquidated damages. So, $10,000 in unpaid wages becomes $20,000, and liquidated damages are the norm. They are not the exception. The rationale for this is that wages alone, back wages alone, are insufficient to make that employee whole for having to wait so long to get paid, their lawful wages. And so, I can give you an example from my practice. There's a very, very limited exception to liquidated damages when there is a violation, and that's essentially a good faith defense. And it's not good faith as in, hey, I thought I was complying with the law. Anyone can say that, but this is where a company has gone out and sought guidance, and maybe it's legal guidance as to an exemption or how to pay people, or HR professionals, and then there's subsequent reliance on that. So that may be a defense. I've had that before, where in a case where there was a dispute over an exemption. In the end, we had I think it was a 10-year-old fax from a counsel to the company saying, here's this decision. It looks like based on this, you can pay according to this exemption. In the end, that might not have been the case, but that was a great defense to liquidated damages. So it just goes to show being proactive doesn't just assist in compliance, but also on the back end if you're ever sued for these wages.
And Brian, I just want to point out, maybe for small employers, so many times you got a small growing business that it's maybe an overused term, but the employees, that they're like family, right? We work together for a long time. We all know each other really well, and all this record keeping, all this precision sounds very legalistic and doesn't sound like it's part of our culture. And hey, I'm not worried about it. But then in the face of a pandemic, or there's major changes, that employee who works in your place of business, maybe it's an office, maybe it's a warehouse, maybe it's a retail facility, but you're face to face, you're talking through things. It's kind of just generally known when the person shows up and when they leave and when they work. But if that person all of a sudden is working from home, just think about the life pressures that have happened to people during the pandemic, whether it's childcare, whether it's elder care, whether it's being sick, and medical bills and inflation, and you lack that face-to-face connection with people. They may be working more hours than you even know. They may be thinking they work more hours than they actually are, but they have this feeling of resentment or frustration that can build up in relationships that you think are solid, and you don't have to really worry about this stuff. All of a sudden, all it takes is one. And maybe it's the frustrated spouse of your employee who's saying, hey, you need to get paid for these extra hours you're working. And maybe it's the spouse who notifies the State Department of Labor. And now you're not just dealing with an employee, you're dealing with an audit that goes back for 5 years to where you have to prove all your records. And this isn't just a one employee thing. This could be a really big, really expensive consequence. Am I overstating that?
Not at all. If anything, that's an understatement, because absolutely, what you said, it just takes one. So right, the two main enforcement mechanisms here are through private lawsuits, where an employee hires an attorney, or through Department of Labor enforcement. So like you mentioned, this can be through the US DOL. They oversee the FLSA, or through a state labor agency, which would oversee the state regulations. And right, those can be initiated by one employee complaint. What we typically see is they're not just investigating that one employee's claim. The DOL is going to come in, ask you for all your employees, or maybe everyone in that classification. Right. So it's going to be expansive. They're going to want records. They're going to want to see it right away. And so, right, the DOL, I think, the US DOL alone, not even talking about state ones, they close about, which means they settle essentially about over 20,000 cases a year. In the last 5-6 years, I believe they've recovered over $1 billion for employees, and that's not even including liquidated damages. That's just the unpaid wage component. So the DOL coming into your workplace, I have clients all the time. They call me. I have a DOL investigator who just walked in. They're interviewing my employees, and they've said I have a week to give them, all these records and tax records, and they're entitled to do that. They can walk in and start looking around and talk to your employees. So that's a big risk area. And then private enforcement. The plaintiff's bar in this field seems like it's ever growing and ever more active. And these range from one employee lawsuit just on behalf of themselves through nationwide or statewide class actions. So one employee can file a lawsuit on behalf of all similarly situated employees. So that's why we say when you have a small compliance issue in the wage and hour context for one employee, understand that however many people you have in that classification, that exposure grows exponentially, and all it takes is that one employee who's interested. And just to note, in the private enforcement context in courts, these employees can recover their attorney's fees, which means if they prove that they have not been paid correctly, the company, is going to be paying their attorney's fees. That's a huge amount of leverage that, leads often to settlements where there's, issues with compliance. So, what we're going to get into today, I would say pay attention, look into it yourself, seek out guidance, from, HR consultants like Asure or Counsel if you need, because these are not isolated issues. These can become big.
Hey, Brian, I know we want to spend most of the time today talking about the actual things that employers need to be aware of, but there's another bucket here, right? So there's class action, Department of Labor, what I'd say wage and hour kind of stuff, but there's a separate bucket around taxation, right? I mean, I'm assuming it's all, but maybe it's most states. So federal tax is kind of blankets no matter where you're located, as long as you're working in the US. But if I work half the time on the Missouri side of St. Louis and half the time in the Illinois side of St. Louis, presumably state of Illinois and state of Missouri are going to want their taxes, right? So can you speak into the tax impact when it comes to penalties and consequences of doing this wrong?
Sure, absolutely. So, and when you talk about taxes, we probably need to even break it down from there. There are different tests for where an employer might be subject to taxes, whether you're talking about, unemployment insurance.
And let's reserve getting into the details of what people need to know, but just speak to the consequence, because Department of Labor is the defense mechanism and enforcement. It's who enforces wage and hour, and then you have the court system for class action or personal lawsuits, right? But the IRS has their own enforcement independent. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're looking at the IRS, and often with these types of issues with remote employees and issues of where taxes should be paid, you're talking about their state taxation departments. And yeah, companies who turn a blind eye to, where their employees are actually working could very well be subject to, penalties for failure to pay taxes, late fee assessments for, late filings or not having paid things correctly. So, as we'll discuss, just ignoring these issues doesn't make them go away. And right, even outside of the wage and hour context, taxes, will very likely be owed to different states, or withholdings will need to be made, for different states depending on where employees are. So, there are certainly penalties in that realm that you'd be subject to for for not filing, for instance, in a state where you have employees performing work.
So we kind of have. I'm gonna advance the conversation, but we're kind of talking about things today in two different buckets, then, right? Bucket number one is wage and hour stuff around Department of Labor, Fed, Department of Labor, state. It's around overtime laws. It's around minimum wage. Maybe there's different classification issues for exempt versus non-exempt. There's all that wage and hour stuff, and then there's taxation. So I think that's what we're going to try to unpack in our conversation today. Let's touch on some of the examples. Now, we can never talk about every example that exists. Even if we had it current yesterday, it'd be changed today. But what are some of the big things that employers need to understand about the differences between federal and state regulations here?
Right. So when we look at it, we're talking about, the federal, the FLSA sets the floor. And then we have some states that simply follow that. And we have others that, set higher standards. And that can be, minimum wage, salary levels for exempt employees, a number of things. So, I'll start with, exemptions, right? So as I said before, all employees should be paid, an hourly rate in overtime, unless they fall into an exemption from overtime. Now, the salary threshold, which is the amount, the level of the salary, whether it's 50,000, 60,000, that depends on the state. And federally, there is the FLSA says that exempt employees need to be paid at least a little over 35,000 per year on a salary basis. And there's some states that follow that, like Alabama. So let's say you're an employer in Alabama and you've got an exempt employee, you're paying them, 37,000. You're meeting the FLSA requirements. And then, that employee wants to work remotely back from, where they come, and that's out in California. And now you're an employer in California with, in the 1 to 25 employee category, and exempt employees there need to be paid at least 58,000 and change per year. So, you have an issue. If you keep that person exempt, you'd likely have to raise their salary up to up by 20,000 or more. So there are issues with the salary threshold, and depending on where an employee is working, you may have to change their exempt or non-exempt status, or raise their salary to comply.
I think Brian, that's an area where people just don't think. Like common knowledge, say New York State, New York City, California, they have their own overtime laws, right, that are more favorable to employees than the FLSA, than the federal. But a lot of people don't realize the minimum pay requirements of being an exempt employee in these states. And so to understand, if you have a remote employee working in one of these states, it's not just whether you do or don't have overtime, and maybe they're exempt, you see them as an exempt employee, and now they're working from home in one of these more employee-friendly states, it could literally mean as much as like a $20,000+ raise that you might have to give if you don't understand the impact of exempt versus non-exempt, not just whether you're paying overtime or not.
Right, right. And similarly, along with, that there might be different rules for, the duties test under certain exemptions that that states apply. So, you really need to look closely. Usually we say, right, your exempt employees, you're generally safer in terms of compliance, as long as you've classified them correctly. There aren't as many pitfalls as with non-exempt employees, but right, the threshold question is, when my not when my exempt employee goes to a different state, are they still exempt? And the parallel is for non-exempt employees. Many states have higher minimum wages than the 725 federal minimum wage. Again, California and New York would be are great examples for that. Both are over double that amount. So you need to be aware, even for your non-exempt employees, when they're working in a new location, what's the minimum wage requirement there? So certainly something like that, you might even have issues with places, different locations within a state. Not all states do that, but we're picking on New York and California, I think, but they are two of the very employee-friendly states, and depending on where an employee is working within those states, a move from upstate New York, to New York City can trigger a higher minimum wage level. The same way in California, moving from say San Diego, where the minimum wage is around, I think, $14, to San Francisco, where it's above $16. You need to recognize how you might need to pay someone differently just by moving even within a state.
Brian, I think I alluded to it at the top of the discussion, and if you could kind of make it more clear for people. So I think there's a spectrum, right? So like I've got an employee who we've had a rather formal conversation. Hey, can I work from home? I want to work from home, or I'm gonna spend Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays in my home, and that's a different state or whatnot. And that's kind of a pseudo permanent setup. I can research the local laws. I can understand the tax ramifications. That's probably more black and white here. But what about the employee who just is a little bit flexible? It's maybe not super rigorous. Maybe the employee says, hey, I was going to take PTO. I know this is really crunch time for us. I'm going to work on what was going to be my vacation. The kids will be at the beach, but I'm going to be online all day doing conference calls, but I'm going to be at the beach in a different state. How tight do employers need to really study this for work being performed in a different location, for much smaller periods of time?
Yeah, so I think generally, I think if it's a vacation or some very short period of time, there's much less concern about these issues. That's likely if there's not an intention to stay there, and it's really, like you said, a vacation, then we're likely not triggering those states, right? You have an employee who's on a call, a conference call, and they're driving across country. No, we're not triggering different minimum wages as we go through each state. I think what we're talking about today is more someone relocating, right? That for the foreseeable future, or for months, they're going to be in a location. So we're not so much concerned with very short-term issues. It's much more something that's indefinite, or going to be for a substantial period of time, and then we have
I
to.
want to give as concrete guidance as we can on this topic, even though I think by definition it's not super concrete. I'm just thinking back to a few years back. I had some experience doing payrolls for Major League Baseball teams, and there's a case where the states, they want their money, they want their tax money, right? And so you got a baseball player who's making $10-20 million a year, and their contracts are spelled out on a pay per game basis. You can bet that a St. Louis Cardinal who might reside in St. Louis, Illinois wants their taxes when they go play the Cubs, right? And that's on a per game, which is really a per day basis. So in most extreme cases, only because there's a lot of money to be had there, states will pursue this on the more micro time level. But is there any guidance we can give for the average business that we should just be that we could give more concrete guidance here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the safe route is really, anything beyond a, vacation time, right? When someone's on vacation, there might be some work, but I think anything beyond that, you need to start looking into this. There might be, then, state guidance, as to, your state and where the potential work state is, in terms of, how much time or, what is sufficient to trigger it. But yeah, I would say anything where someone is, going somewhere specifically, and that is going to be, their place of work. We're talking about these issues,
And
vacations.
Brian, the last thing, maybe again, alluded to it at the top of the hour. I believe in all cases, and I think it's safe to say all, the litmus test here is the location where work is performed, right? So the fact that my employer, Asure, is headquartered in Austin, Texas, I reside and I work virtually in St. Louis. Therefore, I'm taxed. I have Missouri taxes. I have Missouri laws I must comply with, that my employer must comply with. So our guidance here is don't think of where your quote unquote headquarters is or your main office, that maybe a satellite office that an employee is kind of attached to. It's literally where the work is performed when we think about virtual work. Am I correct there?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's about that location where the work, the services are being provided. So again, that, may or may not be that person's house. That might be, somewhere else. A rental house, wherever it might be. But right, we're not saying, I'm Assure we're located in Texas, we're going to pay everyone, according to Texas law. No, it's dependent on where that employee is located when performing the work.
Okay, and maybe my last question to this, and this might sound just kind of nitty gritty, but so vacation doesn't count. But if it's going to be ongoing working relationship, this is what we care about. What if an ongoing relationship is a traveling salesperson, and by definition, their job takes them on the road? Would they be subject to be taxed in the states in which they are selling, or is it going to be just the state in which they say reside and work from as their home office?
Excellent question, and I think there are some, particular issues for, those outside sales, those outside commission salespeople. So, right, I mean, if they are performing sales and, getting business in other states, yes, then we might be looking at those states for both wage and hour purposes, as well as tax issues, including maybe, it could possibly be, income, tax, but also, maybe even sales tax, right? You might even be subject to, filing, corporately there, and, get authorized to do business in that state, if you're, having sales done in these various states. But, and I think, bring it back to wage and hour. One thing that I've seen arise during the pandemic with commissioned salespeople is that, right, these are typically, your individuals that are exempt because they're doing outside sales. They're traveling, they're going to different customers, potential customers. And, during the pandemic, a lot of that changed, where that commissioned salesperson may be working from home and they're doing, Zoom calls or, making, conference calls all day instead of actually visiting customers. And, if we recall, one of the main elements to that exemption is that they are customarily away from the employer's place of business. Now, when they're working from home, that may become the employer's place of business. And so if they're just, taking all their calls from home and not going out in the field anymore, there could be, a possibility of the commissioned salesperson exemption, no longer applying. Something to take a look at.
Topic for another day. I think it's going to be interesting over this next 3 to 5 years, probably, where quote unquote inside sales reps are non-exempt, outside sales reps are exempt. The lines between the difference between an inside and outside sales rep in the world of video conferencing, in pandemics and post-pandemic, I mean, people are doing sales reps are doing $1 million deals all the time without ever going on site. These two worlds are gonna collide, are already colliding. It'll be interesting to see how this pans out over the next few years.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, let's move on to some practical guidance. So how can employers reduce their risk in these areas?
Sure. So, it sounds so simple, but the first thing I'd suggest is you need to know where your employees are working. It's not enough to just understand this concept of remote work, but when you have employees who are not working at an office, you need, the company needs to understand where they are working from. I've seen various studies that basically show that companies in HR overestimate that employees are telling them and keeping them apprised of where they're working from, and that employees are much less often actually telling their employers where they are working from. So, with that, there should be policies, whether it's in the handbook or other separate policies that require employees to inform the employer where they are working from. And not just that, but in advance of changing their work location, they might need to get permission from the company. So putting something in a handbook like that and enforcing that policy is probably the first and most minimal step that a company can take. Because none of this, you can't ensure compliance with another state's wage and hour laws if you don't know that your employee is actually working there. It's such a basic thing. So there should be documentation of that. We should know where people are working, and then again, once the company knows where the employees are working and has approved that that work location, then it's on the company to study up on compliance in a new state, whether that's the tax issues or the wage and hour requirements. And again, a lot of what we're talking about today is minimum wage, overtime, but there are so many other wage and hour issues that may vary from state to state, such as record keeping.
Give a couple examples if you could.
Yeah. So, for instance, here in New York, when an employee is hired, there's a notice of wage rate and payday. A very simple form to provide, and it needs to be provided within 10 days of the start of employment, or the start of working in New York State, we'd say. And failure to provide that can lead to penalties of up to $5,000 per employee. That's massive exposure. So there are certain notice requirements like that. There are also other pay requirements. While overtime is generally a thing that's 40 hours in a week, after that it's time and a half their regular rate. But there are other states, again, we'll pick on California, where there can even be a daily trigger for premium pay. So employers need to be aware of those unexpected pay requirements. And so and even outside of the wage and hour context, I won't go into these things, but There could be harassment, sexual harassment and training requirements for employees in certain states. There are going to, we have the FMLA, which, funny enough, if you ever get audited by the US DOL for wage and hour issues, they will actually ask you about your FMLA policies and such as well. So we have, the federal FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, but states have their own leave laws. So having one employee might, telecommuting from a certain state might be enough to trigger leave requirements. Another thing I can think of are, non-compete and non-solicit agreements. Enforcement there varies, based on, state, laws or, court precedent as to, what might be reasonable. So, a non-competition agreement that you entered into, that was, kosher in your state may run afoul of the law in another state. So, we could go on, but there are lots of issues to be aware of, and that's why, employers can, reject or, deny an employee's request to work remotely.
I can think of an example, Brian, where an employee, they had to work remotely during the pandemic. They, pretty innocently assumed that meant they could work virtually anywhere. They literally relocated without telling the employer. They moved to a state that would have then required that employer, that company, to file sales tax in the state, because the state law there read that if you have employees here, you must pay sales tax on revenues generated from customers who you have in the state. So this company had customers in that state, but not employees. And the tax bill that resulted literally was about as much as they were paying that employee. So there are really good business reasons to say no. It doesn't mean you're just not with it and with the modern times and saying no to virtual work. There's real, meaty consequences to some of these decisions, and it may be reasonable to say no, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's a difference between, permitting remote work versus permitting remote work from anywhere. And that's what an employer needs to consider, because, a lot of small and mid-sized companies are not equipped to, have, multi-state, compliance. They're set in one location. Maybe they have services and sales in a couple of states, so they know how to deal with, tax and possibly wage and hour implications in those other states. But remote employees going outside of that zone can present problems. So there should be a process. I think this is something 5 years ago we would have never considered this in a handbook, but there should be a process for both requesting to work remotely outside of the jurisdiction, and the procedure for how the company handles it, right? This isn't something that we want, managers making decisions on and approving requests without, talking to HR or, going higher up the line, because, that risks, inconsistent decisions. And, when we have, when we have the granting or denial of remote work requests happening, in inconsistent bases, then that could risk even a discrimination claim, right? That my request for remote work in a different state was denied when someone else who's not in my protected category was granted that. So companies need to keep that in mind too, that while they're making all these decisions and setting these policies, that it needs to also be applied consistently. And again, as we always say in discrimination, issues, right? You're relying on, business-related, legitimate factors in approving or denying, these remote work requests.
So no surprise, the number one solution to almost all problems is communication, right? It's communication in the recruiting process and sharing your policies. It's communication in the onboarding process. It's communication of having an employee handbook and having the right policies in the first place. communication is at the center, and then it's doing your homework in these geographies you choose to do businesses. And I say geographies, not just states, because laws are different in New York City than they are in New York State, right? There are school district taxation issues all over Pennsylvania that one township from the next may be different, right? So, Brian, maybe one last topic here before we move on to compensated time is this kind of trend for RV workers, RV employees. I know in personal experience, I had a 1099 employee in a company I owned several years ago. That was kind of at the early days of this world. And he was awesome. He did his work literally from the RV. He went from national park to national park and never missed a beat on deliverables. But it was a 1099 relationship. I didn't bat an eyelash. I actually had to decline a great marketing candidate. I loved her, super talented, but she wanted to live the RV life and couldn't commit to amount of time in certain locations that would make her employment predictable. But it was going to be a W-2 relationship because we were going to dictate the work to her, and so it wasn't a fit. This is a real trend that's growing. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so absolutely, and this can present even more compliance headaches than a remote employee who's in a different state, maybe employee friendly, but in one set location. Because here with someone traveling around, going from state to state and city to city, jurisdictions even within those, right? They could be triggering all sorts of compliance requirements that an employer might very well, most employers would not be equipped to keep up with. And so in this circumstance, it's absolutely fine to say no. And I think, like you said, a lot of this starts with an offer, right? That these issues should be addressed. The expectations of where employees should be working should start from the very beginning. That an offer letter should say you're expected to work from like you said, St. Louis, and that's where your job will be. And you're not, maybe there you put in explicit language nowadays because of this risk, that you're not authorized to work anywhere else. And then if they accept that offer, they're subject to those terms, and you likely have a handbook that would let them make a request. But again, it's absolutely fine to tell these employees, no, you can't do this. I think a lot of employers want to, accommodate their employees. I'm not talking about a disability accommodation, just, in general, keep them happy. But, there are, repercussions to that, from wage and hour through tax, through, all sorts of other aspects of the employment relationship. And as an employer, you don't want to be taking on, these unknown risks, just so that, the employee can have this freedom to travel the country. That might not be something that's going to work for your company.
Brian, let's talk a little bit about compensated time. What does the topic even mean, and what should employers understand here?
Sure. So when we're talking about compensated time, it's really look, employees should be paid for all hours they're permitted to they work. And that can even include hours that they're not instructed to work, but that they work anyway. So even under normal conditions, for non-exempt employees who are working at the business location, there are enough pitfalls in this area. But for employees working remotely, it just exacerbates these issues, right? There's really a heightened risk here that employees will perform what we call off-the-clock work, which means they're working and they're not reporting that time, or it's not being captured by the company's timekeeping systems, and they're not getting paid for that. It might be time worked under 40 hours, so they need to be paid at least minimum wage for that, or it might be, overtime hours, and you really have, an overtime compliance issue. And there are really all sorts of ways, this can arise. I see. I mean, I would tell you in my litigation experience, I do a lot of wage and hour defense work. Off the clock claims are by far the most common claim I see. And so, sometimes this might be caused by just a complete failure to track time. Hopefully no one listening to this is in that category. You at least have some procedure for contemporaneously tracking employee time. But then even when there is tracking of time, it's like we also have issues of an employee clocks out and they continue to work, or they're not reporting that time because they know it won't look good because their manager said, we need you to get this done in X number of hours, or, you can't work overtime. So, there are many ways that with the company's knowledge or even without it, that employees might work, time that is not being captured and not being paid. So again, the first step here is to have a policy, a written policy requiring employees to track their time, and obviously having that way to track. And just as a quick aside, there's no set way under federal or state laws as to how to track time. It can be the old-fashioned punch card. It can be a fingerprint scanner, or anything in between. But it needs to be contemporaneous and accurate. So employee, and it should be the employee's involvement, right? I often have clients where we have a manager who's tracking everyone's time. Well, that's probably not even realistic in the remote world. So we want employees to have involvement in, entering that time. And look, companies, especially with remote workers, should audit this. If you're paying an employee for, a 9 to 5 job, but they are sending out emails before 9 or after 5, you as a company, you have constructive knowledge that they are performing work that they're not getting paid for.
What about the flip side of that, Brian? I mean, I'm outing myself here. I mean, I know I've got non-exempt employees. I'm probably pretty guilty of sending some emails or some Teams chat messages before 8 a.m. and after 5 p.m. Try really hard not to do it on the weekends, but this isn't just employees sending email. What's the burden on the employer for sending messages? Because I would think there's this implied pressure from the employee, like they need to respond to their boss.
Yeah, and that's where I think training managers and higher ups within the company about how we treat non-exempt employees and what their schedules are. I mean, for instance, it's very easy if you want to send, if it's and I do this too. It might be midnight and I'm sending an email, and I might just hit the delay delivery until 9 a.m. the next morning, so that they're not getting that email in outside of normal work hours and feeling compelled to respond. Look, there are even more ways to handle that. You could even cut off non-exempt employees' access to certain things outside of their normal work schedule. That might not always be feasible, but that's probably something that can be considered. But yeah, from the employer, you don't want to
think about guidance even for myself. What would it be reasonable to say, hey, as long as you have good documentation that you trained your employees that, hey, you might occasionally get some email that you're a member of a group thread, like all sales. This might go to 100 people, and you might be in that group. You are not obligated to read or consume, act upon, or respond to those emails outside of business hours, even if you do receive it. Is that a reasonable, I don't know if it's a workaround, but just way to address something like that, as long as you're documenting it and training on that?
Yeah, exactly. You want to document that, and then look, you're going to have employees that don't follow that guidance and might read those and might send things. And then what companies need to do is, number one, even if an employee works, unauthorized time or unauthorized overtime, you're paying them for that time, but you can discipline them, right? You can bring them in and say, look, why is this happening? We can't have this happening. You're getting a warning. You can, employers often don't understand that, this puts them at risk, this type of off the clock work. And therefore you can discipline, you can terminate employees who are, refusing to follow company guidelines, because in the end, they could intentionally do this. They could be creating a claim, and then they can sue you for that. And you can say, I told them 100 times they couldn't do this, yet they still, continue to work after hours. That won't matter. If they worked it, they're getting paid. So sometimes if you have employees who just, refuse to follow policy, progressive discipline, is the way to go to ensure that, your company is not at risk of, a lawsuit or a DOL audit in this regard.
Yeah, and I would just go back. I want to give specific guidance, Brian, to employers here. This is so hard because if you're trying to create a culture of achievement and excellence in high standards, high performance, man, you hate to pull back the reins on an employee who's trying to go above and beyond and work harder and do more, right? Not in an unhealthy way, but just to be a high performer. But to me, the key guidance here is you got to understand the law, and you can't have policies that usurp the law. In the more transparent you can be with good documentation and training and conversations and communication with your employees, so that they understand the reasons why you have to do the things you do, you're likely to not undermine that culture you're trying to create. But if you're trying to create that culture and then you come at, if you didn't do the training, didn't do the communication up front as to the reasons why, then it can feel counterculture if you come kind of nip that in the bud and have to take disciplinary action. Any other guidance you would give to growing companies?
Yeah, I think the only thing, and following up on what you said, is that, right, and sometimes it will be okay for them to work outside of the normal workday, and we might acknowledge that even when not given permission, they might do that anyway. So you also want to make sure there's a written policy and procedure for these non-exempt employees to report anytime work, whether it's putting it on their timesheets or, emailing HR, that there should be some procedure so that, in the event you're defending a lawsuit, on this area, you would at least be able to establish the company did everything it could to try to, capture all the hours that were worked, and it had no constructive or actual knowledge that, this employee was, violating its policy.
Yeah. Brian, let's take our last topic around tax compliance. How aside from just simply doing the research and knowing what the local tax laws are, and I say local, not state, could be one and the same, but local tax laws are, what's your guidance for employees here?
Sure. So when we talk about, we kind of have to break it down between different types of taxes. So I guess, when we're talking about, state unemployment taxes, there's actually federal law in this area that created a standardized test applicable to all states to determine, which should receive unemployment insurance taxes and, those associated wage reports. What essentially here, when it comes to unemployment, these wage and tax reports and taxes are going to go to just one state, even if the employee splits their time between two or more states. So the test here is really a hierarchy. There's a first question. If you get an answer there, that ends it, and you keep going down until you get an answer. So the first question is whether the services provided by this employee are localized within a certain state, and if there are services outside of that state, are they just incidental to those other services? If this gives you your answer as to which state that is where the services are localized, the inquiry ends there with respect to unemployment taxes. But if the service is not really localized in just one state, Then we go down to, the next three factors, which the first one that we'd ask is, where's the base of operations? If that doesn't give us our answer, then we're talking about, the place from which the services are directed or controlled. And if that doesn't give us our answer, then it's simply the employee's state of residence. So again, that's going to be the test that you look at for unemployment insurance taxes and reports, no matter what state you're in. It's federally mandated, and it's standardized. Then we get into other types of taxes, such as withholding state and local payroll taxes. I'm sure Asure is probably well equipped to answer questions on this, but I'll give it my best shot and give some overview. But certainly employees who are telecommuting in different states can create a what we call a nexus in a different state, which would then potentially obligate the employer that will say resides in another state to withhold state and payroll taxes in that new state. So there are many states that have said, I think there are actually 36 or maybe even 37 states that have said that having just one employee telecommuting from that state will create a sufficient nexus between the employer and that state. And that may be, again, that might be for payroll taxes, but that could be for a whole other, set of issues, such as exposing the company to, sales tax, corporate income tax, franchise taxes in those other states where, that one employee can give them a nexus to.
I'll toot our horn for 2 seconds. This is a strength for us, Brian, that a lot of times, one of the very common reasons customers come to Asure is because they've outgrown their small business payroll platform. In multi-state taxation is one of the top reasons that some of those other platforms can't handle. So, and I love that you're going to beyond just, this is beyond just state employee income tax. This is beyond state employer payroll tax, right? There are franchising filings. There are this nexus, which might require you to pay state sales tax that could be as much or more than you actually pay the employee in some cases, depending on your customer makeup and the taxable revenue of that mix. So really, really, really big potential unforeseen consequences of not getting the tax thing right. Anything else you'd want to add before we wrap?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why, I mean, this is something that, again, right, your payroll, your local payroll company that just operates in one state, likely unequipped to handle this because, every state has their own provisions for handling that, tax nexus, whether it's for remote employees or otherwise. And so, right, having someone that understands what those rules are, the implications. And again, right, this could even go so far as now your company needs to register to do business in another state. There's a lot of stuff going on here that, even an employer just researching this on their own is likely going to, leave some holes, some gaps in compliance. So real important to get guidance on this area.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to close this there. So thanks everybody for joining. This is exactly what Asure does. So clearly we are a payroll processing tax filing company, but also provide HR services. So most small and mid-sized companies can't afford the $90,000, $110,000, $115,000 SHRM certified HR professional that knows all of this stuff, just like Brian knows off the top of his head, to keep you in compliance. And so most entrepreneurs are white knuckling it as the HR legislation gets more and more complex, as the tax laws in changing jurisdictions become more and more complex. It's almost impossible to keep up with. So Asure provides HR services, compliance as a service on a fractional basis. So whether you want just help producing the handbooks that we've discussed in today's call to make sure that you have compliant policies and support your managers, or you want more proactive strategic help for your managers in developing a culture, in recruiting and developing and retaining talent, or you need HR support for your entire team, we can help you at whatever level that your business needs. Brian, you want to just take 20 seconds here and talk about Jackson Lewis and how you guys help customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, Jackson Lewis, we're an labor employment management side firm. We represent companies. And look, I think just like Asure, Jackson Lewis has a national footprint, right? We have offices, 60 offices throughout the U.S. So with issues like this, issues in various jurisdictions, we're certainly well equipped to assist employers, just like Asure.
All right. Well, Brian, as always, enjoy our conversations. And to everyone else, if there's any way we can help with HR compliance as a service or software and services around payroll, tax filing, human resources, time and attendance to track all these wage and hour issues, let us know, and we'd love to help. Until next week, Brian, thanks for our conversation, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Thanks again.